The glowing rectangle of the monitor, suspended on the wall of the Hart Senate office building hearing room, flickered with a harsh, high-definition clarity, casting a blue spectral light onto the face of the man sitting 6 feet away. It was a face Adam Schiff knew better than his own reflection in the bathroom mirror, because he had spent the last 7 years curating it for exactly this medium. But the face on the screen was different. It was younger, sharper, unburdened by the specific gravity that accumulates around the eyes of a man who has carried a secret weight for too long. The timestamp in the corner read March 2017. The audio, piped through the room's high-fidelity speakers, cut through the heavy silence with the precision of a scalpel. "You can see evidence in plain sight," the younger Schiff on the screen said, leaning forward with the predatory grace of a prosecutor who knows the jury is already won. "This is not about speculation, Chuck. This is about a direct line of communication between a foreign adversary and a presidential campaign." The clip snapped off. Blackness swallowed the screen for a heartbeat, then ignited again. December 2017, CNN. The same face, the same tie, the same absolute, unshakable certainty. The Russians offered dirt. The campaign accepted it. That is the definition of collusion. Cut. ABC News, 2018. We have corroboration. We are not talking about isolated incidents. Cut. MSNBC, 2019. Ample evidence. The screen finally went dark, returning the room to the ambient hum of the ventilation system and the terrifying, suffocating silence of 50 reporters holding their breath. Adam Schiff sat motionless. He kept his hands clasped on the polished mahogany of the dais, his thumbs pressed together with enough force to turn the nail beds white, though his face remained a mask of polite, slightly bored indulgence. He was a creature of the legislature, a veteran of 1,000 committee hearings, a man who had turned the dry procedural mechanics of congressional oversight into a primetime television event. He knew how to weather a storm. He knew how to let an accusation hang in the air until it dissipated, starved of oxygen by his refusal to react. But this silence was different. It wasn't the silence of a pause. It was the silence of a predator assessing a wound. Sitting at the witness table, framed by the chaos of photographers who had stopped clicking their shutters to stare, sat Tulsi Gabbard. She did not look like a politician. She did not look like a witness who was afraid of the question. She sat with the spinal alignment of a soldier who has spent long hours in the turret of a Humvee, a posture that conveys not relaxation, but a coiled, kinetic readiness. She wore a suit of dark navy, almost black, unadorned by the flag pins or performative patriotism that usually cluttered the lapels of Washington. On the table in front of her, there was no sprawling binder of talking points, no stack of legal pads frantically scribbled with defensive maneuvers by panicked aides. There was just a single, thin manila folder and a glass of water. She didn't drink. She didn't blink. She just watched him. And in that 3-second gap between the end of the video and the beginning of her testimony, Adam Schiff felt the cold, sinking realization that the script he had written for this morning, the script he had been writing for 7 years, was being rewritten in real time by a woman who didn't care about his poll numbers. To understand the magnitude of the collapse that was about to happen, you have to rewind the clock. You have to step out of that hearing room and go back 4 hours, to the pre-dawn quiet of a Washington morning where Adam Schiff still believed he was the hunter. He had arrived at his office in the Russell Building at 7:00 a.m., moving with the brisk efficiency of a man who has a schedule to keep and a narrative to enforce. The morning air was crisp, carrying the scent of potential. His team was already assembled, a war room of communications directors, legislative aides, and opposition researchers who circled him like satellites around a star. They had the strategy mapped out on a whiteboard. It was a good strategy. It was a proven strategy. It was the same strategy that had worked against Devin Nunes, against John Durham, against anyone who dared to question the orthodoxy of the Russia investigation. The plan was simple: attack the messenger. Frame Gabbard not as a whistleblower or a reformer, but as a disgruntled defector, a woman who had abandoned her party to curry favor with a dictator, a useful idiot for the Kremlin. The talking points were printed on thick cardstock, bulleted for easy memorization. Point 1. Reckless declassification. Point 2. Endangering sources and methods. Point 3. Political retribution. Schiff had practiced the lines in front of his office window, watching the sun rise over the Capitol dome. He rehearsed the cadence, the furrowed brow, the tone of grave concern that played so well on the Sunday shows. "Director Gabbard," he would say, his voice dropping an octave for effect, "are you aware that the CIA explicitly warned against releasing this information?" He practiced the pause that would follow. He practiced the look of incredulity he would give the camera when she tried to answer. He was comfortable. He was safe. He was operating within the bubble of invincibility that had protected him since 2016, a bubble reinforced by a compliant media class that had treated his every utterance as gospel. His chief of staff, a sharp-eyed operative named Patrick, handed him a double espresso and a final briefing paper. "She's going to try to pivot to the Steele dossier," Patrick said, tapping the paper. "It's her only card. She wants to make this about 2017 because she can't defend what she did in 2025. Schiff had smiled, a thin, tight expression. "Let her," he said. "The dossier is old news. It's debunked. It's buried. Nobody cares. If she brings up Christopher Steele, she looks desperate. She looks like she's living in the past. We pivot back to national security. We pivot back to her meeting with Assad. We paint her as a rogue operator. It's a slam dunk." He believed it. He genuinely, truly believed it. And why wouldn't he? For nearly a decade, Adam Schiff had lived in a world without consequences. He had gone on national television hundreds of times, looked into the camera, and promised the American people that he had seen evidence they hadn't. He had hinted at dark secrets, at classified intercepts, at money trails that led directly to the Oval Office. And when the special counsel found no conspiracy, when the Inspector General found 17 counts of FBI misconduct, when the entire edifice of the collusion narrative crumbled into dust, Schiff hadn't paid a price. He had been re-elected. He had been promoted. He had written a book. He had become a hero to a base that cared more about the accusation than the verdict. He had forgotten that gravity exists. He had forgotten that eventually the bill comes due. As he walked through the tunnels connecting the Russell Building to the Hart Building, flanked by his security detail and his press team, he didn't feel like a man walking to his execution. He felt like a prosecutor walking to a sentencing hearing. He thought he was the one holding the gavel. But 3 miles away, across the Potomac River, in a secure conference room at the office of the Director of National Intelligence, a very different kind of preparation had taken place. There were no whiteboards here. There were no communications directors workshopping soundbites. There was just Tulsi Gabbard, her general counsel, and a small team of veteran intelligence analysts who had spent the last 3 weeks digging through the archives with the forensic intensity of a crash investigation team. They weren't building a political strategy. They were building a kill box. The atmosphere in the room wasn't the frantic energy of a campaign. It was the cold, quiet focus of a tactical operations center. Gabbard sat at the head of the table, reviewing the file they had named, with the grim irony characteristic of the intelligence community, the architect's blueprints. It was a chronological record of every statement Adam Schiff had made since January 2017, cross-referenced against the classified intelligence that was available to him at the exact moment he made the statement. It was a map of the delta between what he knew and what he said. The general counsel, a man named Marcus who had spent 20 years navigating the legal minefields of the CIA, slid a flash drive across the table. "This is the compilation," he said quietly. "We pulled everything. The MSNBC clips, the CNN hits, the Sunday shows. We synced them with the closed-door testimony transcripts from Clapper, Electrical, Yates, and Rice. It's stark." Gabbard took the drive, her fingers brushing the cool metal. "Is the declassification order signed?" she asked. Marcus nodded. "Signed, sealed, and delivered to the committee chair. Schiff doesn't know. He thinks he's walking into a debate about policy. He thinks you're going to argue about redactions. He has no idea you're bringing the transcripts." Gabbard stood up, smoothing the front of her jacket. "He spent 7 years hiding behind the wall of classification," she said, her voice low and steady. "He uses the seal of the Intelligence Committee as a shield. Tells the public, 'Trust me, I know secrets you don't.' Today, we take the shield away. Today, we show them that the secrets he claimed to know never existed." She didn't smile. There was no joy in it. For Gabbard, this wasn't about scoring points or winning a news cycle. It was about something visceral, something that went back to her time in the sand, to the medical tents in Iraq where the cost of bad intelligence was measured in body bags. She looked at the file one last time. He lied, she said. He didn't just spin. He didn't just exaggerate. He lied to the country while holding the keys to its secrets, and he's going to answer for it. The hearing room was a pressure cooker by the time the gavel fell. The air conditioning was fighting a losing battle against the body heat of 300 people packed into a space designed for 200. The press gallery was overflowing, photographers jostling for angles, reporters hunched over laptops, thumbs flying across phone screens. There was a buzz in the air, a frequency of anticipation that only happens in Washington when blood is in the water, even if nobody quite knew whose blood it would be yet. Schiff took his seat on the raised dais, adjusting his microphone, arranging his papers with precise geometric movements. He looked out at the witness table and saw Gabbard sitting there, still, silent, waiting. He felt a flicker of irritation. Why wasn't she nervous? Why wasn't she consulting her aides? She looked like she was meditating. She looked like she was waiting for a target to walk into her crosshairs. Chairwoman Collins called the committee to order, her voice dry and rhythmic, reading the standard opening statement about the importance of oversight and the gravity of the intelligence mission. The opening rounds were procedural, the kind of polite, devastatingly boring questions that make up 90% of congressional business. The Republicans asked about the mechanics of the declassification process. The Democrats asked about the potential risks to foreign liaisons. Gabbard answered them all with the clipped efficiency of a military briefer. Yes, Senator. No, Senator. The assessment was coordinated with the relevant agencies. The redactions were applied in accordance with Executive Order 13,526. She gave them nothing. No emotion, no spin, no openings. She was conserving her ammunition. She was waiting for the architect. And then it was his turn. Senator Schiff, you are recognized for 5 minutes. The room seemed to contract. The ambient rustle of papers stopped. The photographers raised their lenses in unison. A wall of glass eyes pointed at the dais. Schiff leaned into the microphone, his face composing itself into the expression of sorrowful determination he had perfected over a decade. He looked down at Gabbard, expecting her to flinch, to look away. She didn't. She stared right back at him, her eyes dark and unreadable. Director Gabbard, Schiff began, his voice resonant, designed for the soundbite. We are here today because you made a decision to override the concerns of career intelligence professionals at the CIA, a decision to release sensitive information that your predecessors, both Republican and Democrat, deemed too dangerous to declassify. My question is simple. When you made that decision, whose interests were you serving? The national security of the United States, or the political interests of the president who appointed you? It was a trap, a classic, well-constructed political trap. If she defended the president, she looked like a partisan hack. If she defended herself, she looked defensive. It was designed to force her into a box, to make her argue on his terms. Schiff sat back, satisfied. He had framed the narrative. Now he just had to wait for her to stumble. But Tulsi Gabbard didn't stumble. She didn't even blink. She leaned forward just an inch into her microphone. Senator, she said, her voice calm, devoid of the defensive shrillness he had expected. I appreciate the question. And I appreciate your sudden concern for the sanctity of classified information. It is a concern I share. As a soldier, I have seen the consequences of compromised intelligence. I have lived them. But if we are going to discuss the misuse of intelligence for political purposes, if we are going to talk about serving interests other than the truth, then we need to broaden the scope of this conversation. Schiff frowned. This wasn't the script. She was supposed to talk about the declassification. Why was she pivoting? I'm asking about your actions, Director, he interrupted, trying to regain control. I'm asking about the document you released yesterday. I am answering you, Senator, Gabbard said, and for the first time there was steel in her voice. You asked about the politicization of intelligence. You asked about endangering national security. So let's talk about that. Let's talk about March 20th, 2017. She opened the manila folder. The sound of the paper turning was the only noise in the room. On that day, in a hearing of the House Intelligence Committee, you read into the congressional record a series of allegations from the document known as the Steele dossier. You read them as if they were intelligence. You read them as if they were facts verified by the agencies you were sworn to oversee. But they weren't facts, were they, Senator? Schiff's jaw tightened. He felt a spike of adrenaline, the fight-or-flight response kicking in. He had to shut this down. Director, the Steele dossier is not the subject of this hearing. We are here to discuss. The subject of this hearing is the integrity of the intelligence process. Gabbard cut in, her voice overriding his without raising in volume. And there is no greater breach of that integrity than the chairman of the Intelligence Committee knowingly reading Russian disinformation into the permanent record of the United States Congress. She looked down at the paper in front of her. You read claims about the President of the United States being compromised. You read claims about secret meetings in Prague. You read claims about financial entanglements. And you did this at a time when the FBI had already interviewed the primary subsource of that dossier, Igor Danchenko, who told them, and I am quoting the FBI interview summary here, that the information was hearsay and just talk, that it was made up over beers. She looked up, locking eyes with him. You knew that, Senator, or you should have known it. You had access to the gang of 8 briefings. You had access to the raw intelligence. And yet you chose to present unverified paid opposition research as legitimate intelligence. You laundered a political hit job through the credibility of your office. Schiff felt the ground shifting. This wasn't a defense. This was an indictment. He could feel the eyes of the press corps boring into him. He needed to pivot. He needed to make this about Trump. Director, he said, his voice rising, taking on a sharper edge. The fact that the Trump campaign welcomed Russian help is established. The fact that they met with Russians is established. To dismiss the very real threat of foreign interference because of flaws in one dossier is exactly the kind of obfuscation. Gabbard didn't let him finish. Flaws, she asked, the word hanging in the air. Senator, it wasn't flawed. It was a fabrication. It was a lie. And you didn't just read it once. You built a 7-year career on it. You went on television night after night and told the American people that you had seen evidence that went beyond the dossier. You told Chuck Todd you had more than circumstantial evidence. You told Anderson Cooper the evidence was in plain sight. She paused, and the silence that followed was heavy, pregnant with the violence of what was coming next. That is why I brought this today, Senator. Because the American people deserve to see the difference between what you said on television and what the witnesses told you under oath when the cameras were off. She signaled to the aide sitting behind her, play the clip, and that was the moment the screen lit up. That was the moment Adam Schiff came face to face with his own ghost. The video played, the younger Schiff spoke, the older Schiff watched, and the room watched them both. The split-screen effect was devastating. On the left, Schiff on MSNBC, 2018, we have ample evidence of collusion. On the right, the sworn transcript of James Clapper, 2018. I never saw any direct empirical evidence. On the left, Schiff on CNN. The Russians offered help, the campaign accepted it. On the right, Sally Yates, we had no evidence of collusion. The rhythm was hypnotic. Claim, denial, lie, truth, TV appearance, sworn testimony. It went on for 2 minutes. 2 minutes is an eternity in television. It is a lifetime in a hearing room. Schiff stared at the screen, his mind racing, searching for an exit, searching for a countermove. But there is no countermove to your own voice. He couldn't claim he was misquoted. The video was continuous. He couldn't claim context. The context was self-evident. He looked at the reporters. They weren't typing anymore. They were watching the screen with the rapt, horrified fascination of people witnessing a public execution. He looked at his colleagues on the dais. The Democrats were staring at their desks, shuffling papers, desperately avoiding eye contact. The Republicans were watching Gabbard with a mixture of shock and awe. And Gabbard wasn't watching the screen. She was watching him. She was watching the color drain from his face. She was watching the architect realize that the foundation of his house was made of sand. When the screen finally went dark, the silence was absolute. It was a physical weight pressing down on the room. Gabbard waited. She let the silence stretch, let it become uncomfortable, let it become unbearable. Then she spoke. Senator Schiff, she said softly, you sat in the room when those witnesses gave that testimony. You heard them say there was no evidence. You signed off on the transcripts. You classified them. You locked them in a vault in the basement of the Capitol so the public couldn't see them. And then, knowing exactly what they had said, knowing that the Director of National Intelligence and the Attorney General had found no evidence, you walked out to the bank of microphones in the hallway and told the country the opposite. She leaned back, closing the folder. That isn't oversight, Senator. That isn't intelligence work. That is a deception operation conducted against the American people. And you were the case officer. Schiff's hands were shaking. Only slightly, a micro-tremor in his fingers, but he hid them below the desk. He had to speak. He had to fill the void. If he didn't speak now, the silence would convict him. Director Gabbard, he said, his voice strained, lacking the resonant baritone he usually commanded. This is highly irregular. You are selectively editing. I am not editing anything, Gabbard snapped, cutting him off with a force that made the microphones peak. I am reading the record. Your record? You want to talk about irregular? Let's talk about the Ukraine impeachment. Let's talk about September 26, 2019. You sat in the chairman's seat, the seat you used to hold, and you read a transcript of a call between President Trump and President Zelensky. You looked into the camera and you said, I want you to make up dirt on my political opponent. You said, I'm only going to say this 7 times. She pulled another sheet of paper from the folder. The president never said that. It wasn't in the transcript. It wasn't in the whistleblower complaint. You made it up. You fabricated a conversation between 2 heads of state during an official impeachment proceeding. And when you were caught, when Congressman Turner called you out, what did you say? Schiff froze. He remembered. God, he remembered. He had called it a parody. He had tried to laugh it off. It was a joke, he had said. I was characterizing the essence of the call. But in this room, with the weight of the compilation video still hanging in the air, parody sounded like what it was, a lie dressed up in a clown suit. You called it parody, Gabbard said, answering her own question. You stood before the nation in the middle of a constitutional crisis, and you improvised a fictional dialogue to manipulate public opinion. And you expect us to believe you now. You expect us to accept your lectures on truth. Schiff looked at the clock. 2 minutes left. He had to survive 2 minutes. He had to get to the recess. He had to get to the cameras in the hallway where he could control the format, where he could interrupt, where he could spin. But in here, he was trapped. He was trapped in the factual record he had spent 7 years trying to outrun. Director, he tried again, desperate to find footing. You are engaging in ad hominem attacks because you cannot defend the substance of your declassification. You are deflecting from the fact that you are doing the bidding of Donald Trump. Gabbard's expression didn't change, but her eyes narrowed. There it was, the crutch, the Trump card, the card he played every time he was cornered. Senator, she said, her voice dropping to a register that vibrated in the chest, I'm not doing anyone's bidding. I am doing my job. And my job is to ensure that the intelligence community is never again used as a weapon by politicians who care more about power than truth. You want to talk about motives? Let's talk about yours. Let's talk about why you kept those transcripts secret for a year. Let's talk about why you fought the release of the outcome of the Russia investigation. You weren't protecting sources and methods, Senator. You were protecting Adam Schiff. You were protecting the narrative you sold to cable news. You were protecting your booking on Meet the Press. She paused, looking around the room, making eye contact with the other senators, implicating them in the silence. I left the Democratic Party because of this, she said. I left because I watched people like you weaponize the institutions I volunteered to die for. I served in Iraq. I served in Kuwait. I know what it looks like when intelligence is manipulated to start a war or destroy a political enemy. I saw it then, and I see it now. The difference is, in the Army, when you lie about intelligence, people die. In Washington, when you lie about intelligence, you get a book deal and a committee chairmanship. The gavel banged, once, twice, sternly. The senator's time has expired, Chairwoman Collins said. Her voice was tight. She wanted this over. She wanted the cameras off. Schiff slumped back in his chair. He had survived the 5 minutes. But he knew, with the instinct of a man who understands the theater of politics better than anyone, that he had lost the war. He could feel the vibration of the phones in the room. The clips were already uploading. The compilation was already spreading. The side-by-side of his face and the truth was already traveling through the fiber-optic cables, reaching millions of screens, millions of voters who would look at him and see not a crusader, but a fraud. As the committee moved to the next questioner, Schiff didn't hear the words. He was hearing the echo of his own voice from the screen, more than circumstantial evidence. It rang in his ears like tinnitus. He looked at Gabbard. She was pouring another glass of water, her hand steady, her focus absolute. She hadn't raised her voice. She hadn't screamed. She had simply held up a mirror. And for the first time in 7 years, Schiff had been forced to look at the reflection. The hearing dragged on, but the energy was gone. The story had been written. The headline wasn't Gabbard testifies. The headline was Schiff exposed. And as he sat there, trapped in the amber of the C-SPAN cameras, waiting for the recess, Schiff began to realize that the architecture of lies he had built was not a fortress. It was a prison, and Tulsi Gabbard had just locked the door. The gavel fell, not with the sharp crack of judicial finality, but with the dull, hollow thud of a punctuation mark ending a sentence nobody in the room had wanted to read. "The committee stands in recess," Chairwoman Collins said, her voice tight with the specific urgency of a politician who senses a containment breach and wants to be as far away from the blast radius as possible. The room erupted into the chaotic choreography of a Washington exit. Senators stood, smoothing jackets and checking phones, their eyes darting toward the exits to avoid the press. Staffers swarmed the aisles, clutching binders to their chests like riot shields. The press gallery dissolved into a frenzy of movement, a collective scramble of reporters filing urgent dispatches, their thumbs blurring across screens, their voices rising in a cacophony of hushed, frantic dictation. "Did you get the clip? Send the side-by-side. I need a reaction shot now." But amidst the swirl of motion, Schiff did not move. He sat perfectly still in his leather chair on the dais, his hands still clasped on the mahogany, looking at the blank screen where, moments ago, his own face had been playing on a loop. The screen was dark now, a black mirror reflecting the distorted image of the hearing room, but the afterimage burned behind his retinas. More than circumstantial evidence. The words echoed in the silence of his own skull, louder than the noise of the room. He wasn't thinking about the legal implications. He wasn't thinking about the next election. He was thinking about the architecture of the video itself, the brutality of the edit, the way Gabbard's team had stripped away the context, the nuance, the protective layer of cable news banter, and left only the raw, naked assertion. His chief of staff, Patrick Boland, appeared at his elbow, breathless and pale. "Senator, we need to move. The press gaggle is forming in the hallway. We have to control the narrative before they start asking about the compilation." Boland's voice was high, pitched with the panic of a man who realizes the talking points he spent all night writing are now worthless. "We stick to the script: political retaliation, weaponization of intelligence, Trump's vengeance tour. We don't engage on the specific clips. We pivot to the danger of declassification." Schiff turned his head slowly, looking at Boland as if he were speaking a foreign language. "Did you see it, Patrick?" he asked, his voice oddly detached. "The side-by-side. They used the Clapper testimony. They used the Rice transcript. They used the exact dates." "It's a hit job, sir," Boland insisted, grabbing Schiff's arm to guide him up. "It's a deceptively edited partisan hit job. That's the line. Now please, we have to go." Schiff stood, buttoning his jacket with mechanical precision. He felt a strange numbness in his fingertips. For 7 years, he had been the master of the clip. He knew exactly how to deliver a 10-second soundbite that would dominate the evening news. He knew how to pause for emphasis, how to look over his glasses, how to convey a sense of grave, historic import. He had built a career on the understanding that the media would take his words, package them with a serious chyron, and broadcast them to the world as news. He had never considered, not once in all those years, that someone might take those same words, strip them of their protective packaging, and play them back to him next to the sworn testimony of the people he claimed to be quoting. He walked toward the exit, his face arranging itself into the mask of grim determination he wore for moments of crisis. But behind the mask, something was cracking. It wasn't fear, exactly. It was the vertiginous sensation of a man who steps onto a floor he believes is solid, only to find himself falling through open air. In the 6 minutes it took Schiff to walk from the hearing room to the microphones in the hallway, the digital landscape of American politics shifted on its axis. In the old world, the world Schiff understood, a hearing would be digested by the networks, summarized by pundits, and presented to the public in the evening. There was a filter. There was a gatekeeper. But this was the new world. And in the new world, the gatekeepers were dead. The clip hit X, formerly Twitter, 45 seconds after Gabbard finished speaking. It wasn't the full exchange. It was the 38-second cut. Schiff, I can tell you that the case is more than that. There is more than circumstantial evidence. Cut to black. James Clapper, I never saw any direct empirical evidence. Schiff, collusion is a fact. Cut to black. Sally Yates, no. Schiff, ample evidence. Cut to black. Susan Rice, no. It was simple, it was brutal, it was unspinnable. There was no commentary, no voiceover, no partisan framing. Just the man's words against the truth. By the time Schiff reached the microphones, the clip had 200,000 views. By the time he cleared his throat to speak, it had 1 million. By the time he finished his opening statement, it was trending globally. The second clip to break was the Baghdad versus CNN exchange. This one traveled differently. It didn't spread with the fiery outrage of the first clip. It spread with the cold, heavy weight of moral judgment. I served in Baghdad while you served on CNN. The line resonated not just because it was a good retort, but because it crystallized a feeling that had been building in the country for years. The divide between the people who live the consequences of policy and the people who talk about it on television. A veteran in Ohio shared it with the caption, "Finally." A mother in Texas shared it with the caption, "Watch his face." And his face was the key. Someone had slowed down the video, zooming in on Schiff's reaction as Gabbard delivered the line. It wasn't anger. It wasn't indignation. It was the blank, terrifying stillness of a man who has been struck and is waiting to see if he is bleeding. That stillness became a meme within the hour. It was the face of the establishment realizing the game was up. The third clip was the parody takedown. This one was shared with mockery, with emojis of clowns and circus tents. Gabbard reading the fabricated Trump-Zelensky quote, followed by the single, withering word, parody. It was the kind of viral moment that destroys credibility not with anger but with laughter. To be hated is one thing, to be laughed at is political death. Schiff stepped up to the podium in the hallway, the lights of the cameras blinding him. He couldn't see the phones in the reporters' hands, couldn't see the view counts ticking up like a doomsday clock. He only saw the red tally lights of the cameras. He took a breath. What we saw today, Schiff began, his voice projecting the practiced outrage of a man defending democracy, was a shameful display of political theater. Director Gabbard has allowed herself to become a vessel for the former president's vendetta. By selectively declassifying documents and stripping them of necessary context, she is endangering our intelligence professionals and doing the work of our adversaries. It was a good statement. It hit all the right notes. Vendetta, context, adversaries. A year ago, this statement would have been the headline. CNN would have run with, Schiff slams Gabbard's shameful hearing. MSNBC would have booked him for the A Block to expand on the danger to democracy. But today, the room felt different. The reporters weren't nodding. They weren't scribbling furiously. They were looking at him with a strange, contemplative expression. They were looking at him and then looking down at their phones, where the compilation video was playing on a loop. A reporter from ABC News raised her hand. She didn't ask about the vendetta. She didn't ask about Trump. "Senator," she said, and there was a hesitation in her voice, a break in the usual deferential rhythm of Capitol Hill press scrums. The video director Gabbard played. It shows you stating definitively in 2017 and 2018 that you had seen evidence of collusion. It then shows the closed-door testimony of Director Clapper and Attorney General Lynch saying they had seen no such evidence. You had access to that testimony when you made those public statements. How do you reconcile that? Schiff froze. This was the question he had never been asked. Not once. Not in 7 years. He had been asked if he was concerned. He had been asked if the investigation was proceeding. He had never been asked to reconcile the lie. "I stand by the committee's work," Schiff said, pivoting automatically. "The fact remains that the Trump campaign solicited Russian help. The Mueller report found 10 instances of obstruction of justice. To focus on specific phrasing or to cherry-pick testimony is to miss the forest for the trees. The threat was real. The threat is real." But Senator, the reporter pressed, and now others were joining in, sensing the blood in the water. You didn't say the asterisk threat was real. You said you had asterisk proof asterisk. You said it was more than circumstantial. You said it was in plain sight. Director Clapper said under oath he saw no direct empirical evidence. Was Director Clapper lying, or were you? Schiff's eyes narrowed. I am not going to litigate the specifics of a 7-year-old investigation in a hallway press conference, he snapped. This is exactly what the other side wants. They want to distract from the current administration's abuse of power. I won't play that game. He turned and walked away. It was a retreat, a tactical withdrawal. But as he walked down the marble corridor, the sound of the reporter's questions followed him, not fading but growing louder. Senator, did you fabricate the transcript? Senator, why did you block the whistleblower? Senator, is the compilation video doctored? He got into the waiting elevator, the doors closing on the cacophony. In the silence of the car, Schiff leaned his head back against the metal wall and closed his eyes. He could still hear them. The fallout did not follow the usual partisan lines. If it had, Schiff could have survived it. In Washington, a partisan attack is a badge of honor. It proves you are fighting the good fight. If Fox News attacks you, it means you are effective. If the RNC attacks you, it helps your fundraising. But this wasn't coming from the right. It was coming from the disillusioned center. It was coming from the people who had believed him. By evening, the compilation video had crossed 50 million views across all platforms. But the numbers were less important than the comments. The comments were a graveyard of trust. A video posted by a man in Michigan, sitting in his truck, wearing a faded Union cap, went viral on TikTok. I voted for this guy, the man said, holding up his phone with Schiff's face on it. I donated to his Senate campaign. I told my family they were crazy for not believing him. I sat at Thanksgiving dinner and argued that Adam Schiff had the evidence, that he wouldn't lie about something this big. And now I see this. He shook his head, looking not angry but exhausted. I feel like a fool, and I'm never listening to another word he says. A Substack article by a former senior producer at a major cable news network, anonymous but verified, circulated through the media ecosystem like a contagion. The headline was, "The Source Who Burned Us." The text was a confession. We knew, the producer wrote. We knew he didn't have the goods. Every time he came on air, there was a whispered conversation in the control room. Is he actually going to show us anything today? But we put him on anyway. He was articulate. He was available. He filled the segment. He gave the audience what they wanted, the promise that justice was coming. We let him use our platform to build a narrative that we knew was hollow. And now that the transcripts are out, we are complicit. But the most devastating blow came from a radio call-in show in Virginia. It was a local station, not a national broadcast, but the clip was ripped and shared until it reached the stratosphere. The caller was a woman named Elizabeth. Her voice was shaking, cracking with the kind of grief that doesn't heal with time. My son died in Afghanistan in 2011, she said. Adam Schiff voted for that war. He went on television then too. He talked about weapons of mass destruction. He talked about intelligence that he had seen. He said we had to go. He said it was necessary. She paused, and the sound of her breathing filled the silence. Then he spent the last 7 years telling me he had intelligence about Russia. He said that was necessary too. I believed him both times. I trusted him because he was a congressman. I trusted him because he had the clearance. Today, I watched that video of him lying about the evidence, and then I watched him lying about the mortgage on his house, and I realized. Her voice broke, shattering into a sob. I realized that he has never told me the truth, not about the war that killed my son, not about the president, not about anything. He is a man who uses intelligence as a word to make us stop asking questions. And I will never forgive him. That clip played on talk radio for 3 days. It didn't mention Trump. It didn't mention the election. It connected the dots between the lies of the past and the lies of the present, drawing a straight line through Schiff's career that revealed the pattern Gabbard had only hinted at. The pattern wasn't just about Russia. It was about the abuse of authority. It was about the way a man in a suit, with a serious face and a security clearance, can look a mother in the eye and lie to her about why her son had to die, or why her country is in danger. And then, just as the initial wave of the viral video was cresting, the second shoe dropped. It was a quieter thud, but in the long run, it would prove to be the one that pinned him to the floor. The Wall Street Journal broke the story regarding the criminal referral from the Federal Housing Finance Agency. Gabbard had mentioned it in the hearing, the mortgage fraud allegation, but amidst the fireworks of the collusion tape, it had been a footnote. Now, with Schiff's credibility already bleeding out on the floor of the internet, the details of the financial investigation took on a new, grotesque weight. The referral alleged that for 16 years, Adam Schiff had claimed his home in Maryland as his primary residence on mortgage applications to secure lower interest rates, while simultaneously claiming his condo in California as his primary residence to claim a homeowner's tax exemption. You cannot have two primary residences. It is a physical impossibility. It is a legal impossibility. To claim both is to lie to a bank, or to lie to the taxman, or both. The irony was so sharp it could cut glass. The man who had spent a decade investigating the financial history of a billionaire real estate mogul, the man who had demanded tax returns and scrutinized loan applications, the man who had positioned himself as the avatar of financial rectitude, was now facing a criminal referral for lying to save a few $1,000s on a mortgage. It wasn't the crime of the century. It wasn't treason. In the grand scheme of Washington corruption, it was petty. But that was exactly why it was so damaging. It was small. It was grassy. It was the kind of banal, self-serving dishonesty that everyone understands. People might not understand the complexities of FISA warrants or subsource verifications, but everyone understands lying on a loan application to get a better rate. Everyone understands claiming a tax break you don't deserve. It stripped away the grandeur. It reduced Adam Schiff from a villain of Shakespearean proportions, a man fighting for the soul of democracy, to a mundane grifter juggling paperwork to save a buck. It made him small. Schiff's legal team issued a statement. The senator has always complied with all applicable laws and regulations regarding his residences. This is a politically motivated referral based on a misunderstanding of the tax code. But nobody was listening to the statement. They were looking at the side-by-side memes that were now mutating. On the left, Schiff demanding Trump's tax returns. On the right, Schiff's dual mortgage applications. On the left, Schiff lecturing on the rule of law. On the right, the FHFA criminal referral. The architect had not just built a house of cards. He had built it on a foundation of mortgage fraud. 3 weeks after the hearing, Adam Schiff sat in his office in the Hart Building. The sun was setting, casting long, melancholy shadows across the National Mall. The frantic energy of the first few days had dissipated, replaced by a sullen, heavy quiet. His fundraising emails, usually reliable cash cows that generated millions with a single emergency alert subject line, were returning historically low numbers. The open rates were down 40%. The unsubscribe rates were up 200%. The base was tired. The base was embarrassed. He looked at the TV in the corner of his office, muted. Gabbard was on Fox News doing an interview with Tucker Carlson. She wasn't spiking the football. She wasn't gloating. She looked calm, serious, almost bored. "It's not about me," the closed captioning read. "It's about the truth. If we can't trust the people with the secrets, we don't have a country." Schiff turned the TV off. He thought about the metaphor Gabbard had used, the architect. He had hated it at the time. He had thought it was melodramatic. But now, in the quiet of his office, he understood it. He was an architect. He had built a magnificent structure. He had constructed a narrative of treason and peril, a story of a Manchurian candidate and a compromised presidency. He had built it with the finest materials available, selective leaks, ominous warnings, gravitas, and the complicity of a media that wanted the story to be true. He had built a cathedral of suspicion, and he had installed himself as the high priest. For 7 years, people had come to worship at that cathedral. They had brought their fears and their anxieties, and he had given them a devil to fear and a savior to follow. He had been the man who knew, the man who saw. But Tulsi Gabbard hadn't attacked the cathedral. She hadn't tried to burn it down or shout it down. She had simply walked into the nave, walked up to the altar, and turned on the lights. And in the harsh, unforgiving glare of the floodlights, the lights of the transcripts, the lights of the compilation, the lights of the mortgage documents, everyone could finally see. The walls were papier-mâché. The stained glass was painted plastic. The foundation was hollow. There was no evidence. There never had been. The building still stood in a way. He was still a senator. He still had his title. He still had his office. But it was an empty building now. The congregation had left. The belief had evaporated. Adam Schiff looked out the window at the Capitol dome, glowing white against the darkening sky. He realized then that the punishment for the architect of lies isn't prison. It isn't even losing an election. The punishment is living in the empty house you built, knowing that everyone on the outside knows exactly what it is made of. He picked up his pen to write a new statement, a new defense, a new pivot. But his hand hovered over the page. The ink wouldn't flow. There were no words left. The screen went black.